Hello, I'm Deb Severson, and you're listening to Transformation Radio. In just a moment, you'll have an opportunity to listen to me interview Julia Hill-Nichols, an OD consultant who uses a variety of assessment tools to work with teams around developing trust. Some of the tools Julia likes are the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI, as well as the Denison assessment. Listen to some of the things that Julia says about not only lessons learned from working with teams where trust was a real challenge, but also some of the quick hit ideas that can really help teams progress and move forward and build trust with each other more quickly. Julia, thanks again for joining me today. I'm really excited to hear about your experience with building trust in the workplace. Why is it important for us to take that on as systems workers, building trust?
Yeah, trust is really the foundation for any relationship to be productive and healthy. And in the workplace, trust is really your accelerant to move the company forward. With trust-based organizations, we have this wonderful coordinated empowerment where people have autonomy to do their job, but they also are actively collaborating with each other. All of that requires trust to drive the company. And recently, the World Economic Forum published a paper, great paper, everyone should read it, and they did that in collaboration with PwC. And they looked at all stakeholders, whether board members, customers, employees, management, etc. And they found 5 business reasons that are really impacted by a high level of trust. And the first one is obviously better business terms. When you trust your clients, etc., vendors, it just becomes that much easier. Enhanced innovation and entrepreneurship, which certainly drives your competitive advantage. More loyal and productive employees, that's usually what people think about when they think about trust. Stronger external relationships, really important. And a greater resilience to withstand those shocks, those crises that are going to happen in your business. And if you've got trust, it's a lot easier to get through
that.
Absolutely.
What's your thought about whether trust is actually growing or falling away in organizations today?
That's really almost sort of a yes/no answer. Mm-hmm. For those companies that look at trust as a core value and incorporate it throughout their operations, how they behave, how they react to each other, then yes, mm-hmm. That there is an increase in trust, and you can take a look at it with the companies that are really consistently moving forward, that they have that trust factor. But trust is not something that you check off the list. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, we've got trust, now on to our next great thing. So it needs to be core.
I know that there's the 100 best companies to work for, where they measure trust within the organization. What are some of the other ways that trust is actually measured?
I think that there's, and I have a bias, so I'll
Sure.
own that right now. I really think that the Denison Culture tool is one of the best tools out there to evaluate trust in an organization. And the reason I say that, it's the way they've designed it. Let me give you an example. One of their statements that people would respond to is, information is widely shared so that everyone can get the information he or she needs when it's needed. Mm-hmm. Well, there's 2 things to that statement, and it's consistent with all their statements. One is that it's not asking about the individual, it's asking about their perception of the company. I think that that's really important. And then secondly, this particular question is a great litmus test,
right?
For trust, because information is power. And we've all worked in situations where information isn't shared, and often it ends up setting up others and eventually the company for failure. We don't trust that we're given what we need, and we don't share because we don't want to be vulnerable in any fashion. So if you take that question from the Dennison Culture Survey, and we did this with a company I worked with, and you dug deeper into that question, you found out that I may trust the people on my team, but I don't trust those other departments.
Right.
And so
there's almost layers of trust within an organization.
Absolutely. And I think that Dennison in particular, of all the tools I've used, really helps companies to figure out what the right question is.
I guess you've worked a lot with organizations where you've seen examples of low trust. I'm wondering if you have any stories that would help illustrate what it looks like when trust isn't very high within an organization.
I don't think that there is any loss of stories of low trust. We've seen it, everything from the Enron to the big the horrible situations to everyday life. I was working with an executive team of a software company, and they had incredible trust issues. And it almost actually shut their doors. In the end, they got through. But the senior developers in a software company, they resented the sales guys because the sales guys were selling stuff that they really didn't have, and they also didn't trust their CIO to step up and say no. The implementation team didn't trust the developers. Because they weren't getting the software in a workable fashion, and so then they were getting beaten up by the clients. The interesting thing was all of these groups were in fact represented on the executive team. I mean, they were all at the table, but there was such a lack of trust, and that the energies were really spent on self-protection. There was no honest dialogue, no problem solving, and a real lack of clarity regarding the issues. The project was a disaster, and the client was furious. We're talking about a lot at stake, and it took them 2 years and millions of dollars to pull it back.
Wow.
And how sad. So that that's. That was one area, and what allowed them to pull it back was a change up in leadership that in fact did trust each other and got about solving the problems. But there was a very heavy cost for that organization and people's jobs.
Well, it makes me wonder, what are some of the things that can be done when there's such broken trust within working relationships? Where do you start?
You have to start at the top. Obviously, you've always got to start with the executive team, and more specifically, it requires the CEO to. The phrase I often use is to man up, and recognize that we have a serious issue, and sometimes that requires a change at the top level, because it is hard.
When you go in and you start working with an executive team, as you said, it starts at the top. What are some of the protocols that you do? Like how do you help?
How do you help? I am a big fan of Pat Lencioni, as you know, and I use the 5 dysfunctions of a team model when I first go in. And as a component prior to the meeting, I utilize the MBTI, and so I have a sense of who folks are and how they operate. I think probably one of the first things that has to happen in building trust and literally just getting them, slow down to speed up, take some time, get to know each other, understand each other's MBTIs, and that gives them a language. where before they struggled with sharing, this is how I take in communication, or this is how I deal with conflict, now the MBTI gives them a common language, which is helpful. I think the next step is really getting that team to understand that that is their first team. The executive team is their first team. Most executive teams, if you talk to people, they say, who's your team? They will talk about their department, their division, etc.
Right.
That's their first team. And so the problem with that is that it really escalates this whole silo mentality. What's in it for my team? How does that impact my department, etc.? And so there isn't that open dialogue that occurs. And so it really does require the CEO to sort of force the issue and say, folks, this is your first team. Yeah. And if you're not comfortable with that, let's talk about what we need to do.
It really, it's such a great example. It really reminds me of how important it is to have those shared core and common goals at each level. And once they find that connection and alignment, it's easier for it to cascade down.
Much easier.
Yeah, that's great.
Much easier.
So what's the cost of not having high trust in the workplace? I mean, you gave a great example a few moments ago, but if you think about where it really hits the bottom line, what's your belief about that?
Probably, I mean, the greatest cost is speed and good decisions. Those are your two big cost items. I think that organizations that lend themselves to low trust you get sucked into a lot of bad behaviors, and it's not just the executive team where you're going to see those costs really pop up. I'm reminded of there's sometimes we have positions in organizations that sort of lend themselves to low trust. So accounting and HR,
sure,
great examples. That they just tend to not trust. Well, it's not just the people in those positions. It's literally how we've set it up organizationally. That we sort of foster this low trust in those positions, and they end up acting as real blockers for management, to no one's health. There was an accounts payable person in this company, a very low trust, and in fact, and you talk about it in your book, Deb, that we've got three components within trust, right?
Right.
So we have competency, can they do the job, and then we've got this issue of, do they have the capacity to trust? And in this particular situation with this accounts payable person, they truly didn't have the capacity to trust.
Oh wow.
And so if you don't have the capacity to trust, of course you just don't get anywhere. It's just not going to work, and they didn't, and to the point that they didn't trust anyone, and people became fearful of them. And what happens is organizations start working around those folks, and they find other ways that aren't necessarily healthy,
right,
but get them what they need.
Yeah.
So the costs are high. You've got increased fear. You've got people spending their time, doing all of these workarounds when what you really need them to do is spend time on getting their job done.
Yeah.
But we don't allow that.
And withholding information, I would think too, from each other is a really big deal.
Yeah. Well, the example of the software.
Yeah.
Company, they were withholding information from each other. And so, people were making decisions based off of bad data,
right,
and assumptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How, with a really good strategy, how long does it take to move the needle from, let's say, from low trust to even something that's starting to become more healthy and functional?
I think that you can move the needle really quickly. I mean, here's the great thing. So I was walking down the hallway of a client, and a couple of the staff came up to me and said, what have you done to our executive team? Which I thought was kind of interesting. And I had been working with the executive team for just a couple months. And, just kind of coming in for 2 or 3 days, leaving, coming in for 2 or 3 days, etc. And what I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, and they sort of described how they interacted with the executive team. Well, what they were doing was playing a mom-dad game. So if one director was going to give them a no, they'd go to another director and get the yes. And because the executive team was so dysfunctional, they didn't get it. It was great, And so the staff had been doing this for years, sort of doing this mom-dad thing. And actually what that did was just sort of fuel the fire of the mistrust on the executive team. So they said, well, now these guys, happen to be all guys, they're talking to each other. And, they're going out for coffee together, and it's really very disconcerting to us. And I laughed and I said, that's great. You need to think of other ways to move your agenda forward, because your old game is no longer going to work. And that was within, I would say literally 2.5 months. Mm-hmm. Because it's not just the time I spend with a team. It's what they do afterwards. And making sure that this is not kumbaya stuff. Yeah. This isn't soft stuff. This is hard, and trust takes time, and it's constant. And you don't get to say, okay, we have a trusting organization, we're done. Mm-hmm. You're constantly having to go back.
Yeah, it's almost that question starts to come to the forefront, like how transparent really are we? Because there's different levels of that too.
There absolutely are. I am reminded of a time when there was I was in an all hands staff meeting, so it was all the folks, and the CEO, and they had been working on trust issues, etc. But the CEO had made a decision to go into a particular market, and actually, without the support of his executive team, they did not feel that they should be going into that market. But, they were just so mesmerized, that they were going ahead. Well, it didn't work. And it cost the company some dollars and time and that kind of thing. But here's what it really cost. The trust that they had built on the team got diminished because the CEO hadn't followed the core values that they had established about how they behave. Now, many leaders would say, okay, that was bad, don't do that again, and move on to themselves. This person got up in front of the entire company and talked about how he had not honored their core values by not listening to the executive team, by not being open and honest about what he was doing, and not trusting their advice. And so while he talked about the reasons that it didn't work in that particular market, the real value was for him to stand up and say, I blew it. This is how I blew it. And I apologize to you, and I apologize to my team, and I promise to recommit.
What a great example.
It was
of
wonderful.
Taking ownership. It's incredible.
It was wonderful.
So as we move towards closing, one big question for you.
Okay.
If you had one piece of advice to offer to organizations to help them get on the road to trust, what would that be?
Oh. I think that you've got to be willing, when you're building trust, you've got to be willing to listen, to really understand. Because as you open up that door, you're going to get tested. And so you'll start getting comments from staff that will make you get a little tense. But they're testing. How much does this trust thing really all about? So they're going to push your envelope. So don't bite. Listen to what they are saying. I think the other thing is that it's so much easier to build a trusting relationship where companies understand their why. Mm-hmm. They know why they exist, and they recruit and bring in people based on the why. Mm-hmm. So if you're all around the table and you all believe in what it is that you're trying to do, that becomes so much easier.
Yeah.
It really does. So trust is not something that you get in a workshop. Mm-hmm. You can't read a book and all of a sudden trust. Mm-hmm. Trust is a feeling, and it is everything about the relationship. Mm-hmm. And so if you can really commit to building that relationship, so that in fact you can have trust. That's going to go a long way. I think, there's so many things that, you want folks to do. I think the other thing is that you have got to allow within an organization the ability for people to risk and say, I don't think you're living up to what you say. Or I don't think the organization is living up to what we say, and that's risk, but that's how you really build trust is allowing those situations where people are going to push that envelope and they're going to test to make sure that this is real. They're tired of flavor of the month. Yeah, they're real tired of that.
So really, it's organizations having accountability for building trust within the workshop, within the workplace, and that's also going to require that they take personal ownership, speak up when they
Absolutely.
make mistakes, and really move towards more vulnerability and transparency.
Just absolutely.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh my goodness, thank you.
All right.
Buy the book.